Hey everyone, hope you guys are doing well. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 14 preview. I'm FPL Fran, and we'll be looking at the best sort of transfers for Game Week 14 and what sort of captaincy we should be looking at in terms of Game Week 14. I do think that the default captaincy option probably would have been Salah, but I do think Haaland, of course, has completely stepped into the debate after we've been watching Spurs for the last two matches, particularly in consideration of style of play and the suspension so far. Now, talking quickly about Game Week 14 before we jump into any of the positions, I do think that it's one of those weeks where you have to generally consider, before you even jump into the rest of this video, think about what you want to do with free hit 18. Do you want a free hit 18 or do you not want a free hit 18? This is a great fixture for Brentford, one of the true best fixtures that we have possible. It's Luton at home, and you've got Mbuma, of course, who is a priority transfer option for a lot of managers. But if you wanted to, let's say, push towards free hit 18, then you've got also the option of going for someone like Ethan Pinnock, right, from a defensive point of view, who has a great fixture here, good clean sheet odds once again, and this could be your sort of chance to jump into a Brentford defender. So that's, of course, the question you want to ask yourself. Do you want to dive into free hit 18? And if you want to sidestep it, that's totally fine. Try to ignore, for example, some of the City options and maybe the Brentford options that I might be talking about outside of course, someone like Mbuma, who I do think is still fantastic to own in the short term, and you can maybe even transfer Mbuma out on Game Week 18. That's how good really the fixtures are between Game Weeks 14 to 18 are for Mbuma. Now, quickly talk about the midfield position. Once again, as I said, I think starting off there, Mbuma is the priority transfer, but I think a lot of people know that. If you do think that Mbuma, for example, for whatever reason, isn't going to do well versus Luton, then, I mean, that's fair enough, but I still think that he's still absolutely outrageous at his price point. I do think, though, another great competing option, particularly in the context of, let's say, Bowen maybe still struggling for fitness, and maybe, of course, people who are maybe unhappy with the West Ham attack for whatever reason, to maybe invest into Sterling, right? Because you've got a Brighton at home fixture. Sterling's minutes are still very, very positive right now. He actually is one of the few players who really has done well in almost every Chelsea game this season. I think even in the Bournemouth game where Chelsea were scoreless, he hit the post there with a free kick. So no surprise, of course, that he scores a beautiful free kick versus Newcastle. But this is Sterling, who, of course, has stepped up quite a bit from last season. Of course, there's still the mistakes in terms of decision making in the box, but you can't have it all with Sterling. You have to sort of take the good with the bad. I think Sterling is a fantastic pick right now. This is a great window to jump onto a Chelsea asset. And if you're already on Mbeumo, but let's say you have Bowen and you want to move away from Bowen, or you're, let's say, looking to downgrade from a player, like let's say going out of Son, then I suppose the question is, how strong do you value Son? Do you think he's maybe overrated as a pick? Personally, I think that the landscape right now, the midfield position, is that Son is still a very worthy keep, at least until the West Ham fixture. I think West Ham are showing to be at least a very, very poor defense, really a bottom five defense right now, from what we've seen so far. So no surprise that I think Son actually could be a fantastic option next week, as well after the Man City fixture. So I do think it is worthwhile to consider keeping Son. But if you want to, let's say, go out of Saka or Son in the near future, I do think that maybe, of course, jumping off of Son on this window makes sense, right, in Game Week 14. And if you want to do so, Sterling is a great option. Bowen, of course, if he's fit, and I think he should be fit based on Moyes' comments, is still very, very good. The only thing I'd say about Bowen is I still think that he's a little bit expensive because, of course, he's gotten so many price rises since he was, once again, at a very appealing pick when the fixture started turning, for example, for West Ham. So one of the questions, I suppose, is now that you've actually missed one of the good fixtures in terms of Burnley, Bowen's fixture getting slightly worse until they get good again around Game Week 17. So maybe, of course, you have a window to, let's say, capitalize on someone else. The question, of course, I think is that if Bowen's fit, I really just think that you can absolutely roll your transfer. And the same situation, really, if you own Son. I think, yes, of course, you just admit that the Man City game is a bad fixture on paper, but you get to own Son, for example, against West Ham. As far as I said, other transfers outside of, let's say, Sterling and Mbeumo, if you wanted to downgrade from that price point, one of the issues I think right now is that two of the best budget options in the game in terms of Hwang and Johnson have really bad fixtures for Game Week 14. Johnson is versus City, Hwang is versus Arsenal. However, the two fixtures after that for both players are fantastic. So I think if you have the chance to, let's say, maybe persist with your pick in the budget midfield position, why not wait until Game Week 15 and then maybe exercise that transfer towards Hwang, who we recently found out is on penalty. So I think Hwang, of course, is huge. And then Johnson, of course, getting good minutes in the Spurs team who are just extremely attacking no matter what, is going to be incredibly appealing as well. And I think his minutes are quite strong right now. We saw Johnson have relatively good performance versus Aston Villa as well. But of course, there's Lo Celso there too as well if you really want to look at extreme budget options from the Spurs team, even Brian Hill. Now, in terms of, let's say, Palmer, I think he's a great pick for Game Week 14 because when we talk about these great options at 5.x, I do think, of course, Palmer and Gordon are still fantastic, right? Gordon right now has a better fixture even compared to last week where we had Chelsea at home. And of course, they completely obliterated Chelsea. Part of that due to sort of individual mistakes, right? Thiago Silva's mistake, Reece James's mistake as well, causing, for example, 10 versus 11. But that is going to be a really nice fixture because this Man United team, as we've seen even in the Everton game where they kept another clean sheet miraculously, I would say, they still look very poor in defense. And I don't think we can expect the same from, let's say, Man United away versus such a top sort of lethal attacking team like Newcastle that recently have sort of gotten Isaac back into the team. I think Gordon, of course, is a great pick in that context. I recently sold Gordon for Palmer, so a little bit of regret there. But I still think generally that Palmer is a great option. You're looking at this Brighton team who conceded a penalty to Morgan Gibbs-White. Also, for example, have completely been struggling in terms of open play. Brighton, of course, as we know, have been slipping and slipping on defense, and no surprise that this is a good fixture on paper for Palmer. If you're worried about Nkunku's minutes, as I said, I think there are great options in Game Week 15 that you can wait for that have better minutes. Alternative, of course, you've just got Gordon right there sitting and waiting for you as well as an option. What I like about Palmer, though, is that he's still a little bit cheaper than some of those kind of counterpart options. And for example, like Adingra can actually give you, for example, enough money to maybe upgrade another one of your defenders right now in a sea of really bad fixtures for the 4.5 defenders, in my opinion. So that's one of the options that you can actually go with, Palmer. Gibbs-White, I think, is also a great option, but the question, of course, is do you sort of back Gibbs-White? I think that ultimately Palmer has better fixtures in the short term. If we are talking, let's say, the next 4 fixtures, I would still favor Palmer and his minutes as well. Even if he was to play 70 minutes a game, I'd still prefer that, for example, to, let's say, Gibbs-White over the next 4. And that's one of the concerns. I think with Gordon, I think there's a genuine debate because the idea with Gordon, I think, is actually, if you, let's say, have been holding Gordon all this time, and unfortunately, I no longer do, I think that you can just be holding Gordon effectively until game week maybe 20. And that's going to be a great sort of window to actually own a fantastic run for Gordon because actually Newcastle's fixtures are only really bad from game weeks 20 to 22. So Gordon really can be a fantastic keep in the short term. So I think Gordon's a fantastic pick as well. In terms of Douglas Luiz, I think he's one of the options to think about maybe around game week 18 because of course he has such a good fixture on free at 18, but there's no real reason to actually own Douglas Luiz in the meantime. So that's the midfield position. Now, quickly moving on to the forward position, I think some of the transfers to look at this week, once again, has the same sort of logic as the midfield position, because let's say with Hwang being such a good option, I do think you can wait for next week to maybe go for Cunha as an option as well, when he has a good fixture as well, and he's not facing Arsenal away from home. As far as other forward transfers, I do think right now this is the time to maybe consider whether you want to maybe expand into a 3-4-3 right now, a little bit ahead of the curve, or actually think about downgrading from Watkins. But the issue, I suppose, with downgrading from Watkins, I think Watkins is still pretty much the second best forward this week, with exception to maybe Isaac as well, if you're expecting that Isaac has really good minutes versus Man United. I do think, though, Isaac is a great option if you, let's say, have the sort of price point at, let's say, Alvarez's price, and you're looking for maybe a move away from Alvarez in the short term, and you don't want to pursue, let's say, a free hit 18 sort of strategy. I think that could be interesting. But of course, keep in mind that Wilson is probably going to be coming back in a few weeks' time, and that could impact Isaac's minutes when, let's say, Alvarez's fixtures are also going to be relatively decent, right? Alvarez's fixtures in game week 16 and 17 are really nice. So maybe the question mark, I suppose, is do you actually like Isaac just in general over Alvarez outright, and you're not, let's say, planning to free at 18? So I think that's a great option as well. Darwin, of course, is another great option this week because, once again, we have to sort of wait and see with Liverpool in the European fixtures. They are going to be in the Europa League, but they're in a very, very safe position in that sort of group. And, of course, the question is going to be with Jota, what is his injury situation? Because, of course, if Jota is injured for a while, I think Darwin's minutes are very, very good. He's only really competing with Gakpo, who, of course, can sometimes play in the center mid position. And ultimately, Darwin is an absolute threat. He does not need to play 90 minutes to be a good pick in FPL, and we know that. But recently, he's actually been playing 90 minutes, which of course is very, very nice. Of course, the alternative with Darwin as well is, you know, that on the flip side, he is a slightly poor finisher. This is a reality, I think, of course, when he plays for Liverpool and maybe not for Uruguay. But yeah, I think that's one of the risks that comes with playing with Darwin. Do you want to actually capture that sort of upside? Otherwise, I think really that sort of Watkins Haaland template can last us up until game week 18 plus and beyond, because ultimately Watkins, for example, has a good fixture pretty much until the rest of the season. I think you can see Watkins as a season keeper. His worst fixture is going to be game week 15. If you don't plan on, for example, going from Watkins to, let's say, Alvarez or, let's say, Darwin or even Isaac on game week 15, there really is no reason to move away from Watkins at all. So that's one of the sort of beauties, I suppose, of owning Watkins. And as I said, in the budget position, I think it makes more sense to actually maybe roll, wait, maybe assess as well what is going on with Nkunku and his minutes, or just simply just go for someone like Cunha in the short term. I think Edouard still remains as a good pick, and maybe with Eze out as well, we probably have a higher chance of him being the penalty taker as well. That can be a huge sort of bonus for Edouard and his sort of point potential. And that's it, in my opinion, for the forward position. Now, quickly moving on to the defender position, I do think once again this week is a sort of repeat of last week. We talked about how doubling up on Arsenal defense makes a lot of sense. I think doubling up on Arsenal defense once again makes a lot of sense. The question mark, I suppose, that a lot of people will be asking is, do you have to go Saliba and Gabriel for the most nailed minutes? In my opinion, of course, that's the best case scenario if you're trying to own Arsenal defense. But at the same time, one thing you can say about Zinchenko, who actually has gotten good minutes lately, and of course, an abundance of FPL points, scoring a goal, for example, versus Burnley, getting the triple bonus points in the previous fixture, is the fact that, of course, Zinchenko is the absolute best player in this Arsenal team for getting bonus points, right? He's so good in terms of creating chances, so good in terms of actually hitting those baselines for passing. But the question, of course, is does he play and does he start? And at times we've seen him be a 45-minute substitution. What I would say, of course, is unless you think that, let's say, the Luton away game is going to be very tough for Arsenal and they're going to struggle with the transitional threat in that Luton fixture, or, for example, with the short delay between, let's say, the Wolves fixture and then, of course, the rest needed to go to the Luton fixture, then, of course, maybe Zinchenko's minutes are a threat. But I do think that Zinchenko, for example, in isolation for the Wolves fixture is a fantastic little asset to own. And the question, of course, is going to be, what are Arsenal going to field in the Champions League? Because they're in a very relatively healthy position themselves. And we will find out on Wednesday, for example, what they're going to be lining up with. And maybe if, let's say, Zinchenko gets a rest there, then I think it's perfect, for example, to actually look at Zinchenko as a transfer option, because I would really expect him to play both the Wolves and Luton fixtures if he gets rested. Now, if he plays versus Lens, I think one of the questions is maybe does he miss that Luton fixture? And there's a high possibility of that. But I think if you want to take that risk of going for Zinchenko, it's worth it, because even the Wolves fixture should be really, really good for Arsenal, given how strong they are as a defense. And really, as I said, from sort of our videos and what we've learned this season is that Arsenal have improved, honestly, as a defense year on year, even though last year they were pretty much already a top 3 defense. As far as other transfers, I do think that you can once again wait for next week. And who's the option to sort of wait for next week for? And I think that option is going to be Pedro Porro, where I think his general run of games between game weeks 15 to, let's say, even 18, for example, is very good. And I do think that now that he's on so many set pieces, he's going to have access to, for example, hopefully one clean sheet in the future. I don't really think that we can necessarily expect that with the Spurs team, if we're being honest. But he can, for example, score an open play. He can get assists from the free kicks that he's taking, from some of the corner options that he's taking as well. So that's a huge pick in terms of Pedro Porro in the short term. I think in terms of Chelsea, I would sort of exercise a bit of caution, right? Players like Colwill, for example, are dealing with a lot of rotational threats. Cucurella, who might be suspended game week 14, him playing in the Brighton fixture doesn't necessarily mean that Colwell's minutes are going to be good in the future. I think he's competing with also, if you're thinking about, let's say, the left center back position, Badiashile, Thiago Silva, Fofana, and even Disasi. So struggling to see how he gets into the center back position. And then, of course, we don't really know exactly what Chilwell's situation is, but he doesn't seem too close to the Chelsea team right now. So I think the main threat, of course, is Cucurella, who actually has been playing relatively well, at least from the attacking phase for Chelsea, compared to, let's say, Colwill, who, of course, is a better defender, but doesn't seem to be someone who is, for example, in the top of Pochettino's mind. Or maybe you can, of course, argue on the contrary that Pochettino has really only been dealing with him poorly, I suppose, with the shoulder injury. But one thing I would say is that, for me, I think what shows in terms of how important you are as a defender is things like the 45-minute substitution versus Spurs, where, of course, they were 10 versus 11. Colwill gets a very, very silly yellow card. He loses his head a bit before halftime, and he gets subbed off. In those situations, I feel like you're just not that important in terms of the manager's mind. Maybe he's still seen as a young player, and maybe he doesn't deserve the minutes right now. So I do think that Colwill's minutes are a little bit insecure. If we were talking 3 at 18 options, and you're open to that option, I do think that Pinnock is fantastic, and also so is Walker. I think those are the 2 options really from this Brentford and Man City team that I'd be thinking about. If I want a defender for game week 14, I'd be thinking about Walker. I'd be thinking about Pinnock. That could also just last really for the sort of run of games here, where I can play Pinnock probably sometime, of course, maybe even in a double game week in the future. I can also play Walker in general, for example, let's say game week 16, 14, and 17 as well. And then if we talk about, let's say, some of the default options, I think this week, if you're looking for a transfer, unfortunately, there aren't too many defenders that I really like. I do think, as I said, this is a chance to go into Tsimikas as well, because, of course, if we watch the European fixture for Liverpool, we can kind of understand maybe if Joe Gomez plays in the European fixture, that Tsimikas' minutes for the Fulham fixture should be very, very healthy. But of course, if, let's say, Tsimikas plays in the European game, then I suppose the minutes would once again be called into question. So that's one thing to think about. But however, another thing I would say too is Tsimikas played really well versus Man City. So that could, for example, strengthen his minutes overall in terms of our estimations. That's one thing I would want to say. In terms of defense, as I said, not too many good transfers right now. I think in the near future, we also hopefully would like to get some updates on Botman, because if we can get an update on Botman and know that he's coming into the team, or know that Lascelles will be nailed for the future, I think Lascelles is still a very, very safe, for example, transfer in this week, just to get an option who's so cheap for you this week. Another thing I would also point out is a lot of us have Taylor on the bench, right? Play Taylor this week. It's Sheffield United at home. Sheffield United, probably one of the worst attacks that we've ever seen in Premier League living memory. So why not just play Taylor here? Yes, of course, Burnley, one of the worst defenses as well, but this is really the best fixture for Taylor possible. This is a good chance to get a clean sheet. So I would generally consider playing Taylor. As far as goalkeepers, the only thing I'd actually really mention here is Kelleher is an interesting option, so do look towards him as a pick. And as far as captaincy this week, I think it's a absolute 50-50 split right now between Salah and Haaland. The only thing I would say about Salah and Haaland is, for me, the way Spurs are playing right now, the way they're so gung-ho, the way that teams can also hit them on the counter themselves, just means that Haaland is a fantastic option for me. I mean, just look at the chances that Watkins actually wasted in that game. I think he could have easily got a hat-trick there, and that's not really a joke, right? The center backs right now are full-backs who are much weaker in the air. Watkins has got his way with things in those chances. I mean, missing some really easy headers that I'd be struggling to see, for example, Haaland on the back post missing. And for now, I think even though the Fulham fixture looks so good on paper, look at, for example, Wolves being able to score 2 versus Fulham away from home. That looks and bodes really well for Salah at Anfield. But right now, I just think that Darwin's such an easy pick to go for. They're both playing at home. Tottenham generally do appeal really as a bottom half defense. So should be an absolute game. Should be a riot for both teams. I would just prefer Haaland because, of course, the goal scoring odds are usually always higher with Haaland in comparably, let's say, easy fixtures compared to Salah. So that's what I would say for this week in terms of the Game Week 14 preview. Signing out here. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. If we can get to 20K before the end of the year, that would be absolutely fantastic. And thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. If you remember, see you guys in the next video and take care.